Sometimes the difference between life and death is a lie told to yourself on purpose. Between June 1943 and August 1945, carrier pilots in the Pacific filed after-action reports that followed strict procedures established by the Bureau of Aeronautics. Each encounter required documentation of altitude, heading, ammunition expended, and enemy aircraft type. The reports accumulated in steel filing cabinets aboard ship, then transferred to shore stations, and eventually archived at what would become the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. This isn't fiction. This is the story of how one deliberate error in judgment, repeated until it felt like reflex, turned the geometry of survival upside down. The stakes weren't abstract. By mid-1943, American pilots knew the Zero could turn inside anything they flew. Tighter radius, faster roll rate, lower stall speed, every technical advantage belonged to the enemy. The only question was whether you could think crooked enough to make that advantage meaningless, whether you could train your hands to betray every instinct that kept you alive in training, whether you could teach yourself to want to be where no pilot should ever want to be, slow, predictable, and apparently defenseless, and whether you could trust the man on your wing to understand the plan without a single word spoken over the radio. It's June 8, 1943. Late afternoon light slants across the flight deck of USS Essex CV-9, positioned 200 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. The air smells of salt water, aviation fuel, and hot steel. The deck crew, in their color-coded jerseys, move with the efficient choreography of men who know that hesitation costs fingers or lives. You can hear the wind across the island superstructure, the distant thrum of the ship's turbines, the metallic clicks and snaps of tie-down chains being secured. In the ready room, one level below, 8 pilots sit in canvas-back chairs facing a chalkboard. The chairs are bolted to the deck. The room rocks gently with the carrier's movement through the swell. Someone has left a mug of coffee wedged into a corner. It hasn't spilled. The briefing officer is methodical. He draws the interception geometry on the board with white chalk. Expected enemy approach vectors, patrol altitudes, recognition silhouettes. The routine is so familiar, it produces its own kind of lullness. This is the third briefing this week. The intelligence is the same. The drawings are the same. The outcome, they all know, will likely be the same. The Zeros will dictate the terms of engagement because they own the turn, and Americans will either extend away to use their speed advantage or accept a fight they cannot win. The briefing officer doesn't say this part aloud. He doesn't need to. In the back row, a lieutenant named Jim sits with his plotting board on his lap. He's 23. His flight suit is darkened with sweat stains, under the arms and across the back. Everyone's is. The ready room ventilation is inadequate, and the Pacific sun has been cooking the ship's steel all day. Jim's hands are clean, but his fingernails show the permanent grime of a man who helps his plane captain with pre-flight checks. He's logged 72 carrier landings and 41 combat sorties. He knows how to put the Hellcat down on a pitching deck in a crosswind. He knows the fuel consumption rate at military power and the exact moment the stick goes mushy before a high-speed stall. What he doesn't know yet, sitting in that chair with his plotting board, is that within 6 weeks he will stop making the correct decision in a dogfight. He will start making the wrong one, and he will survive because of it. The first time it happened, it wasn't a plan. It was a mistake compressed into instinct by fear. July 14, 1943. Morning patrol over New Georgia. Jim and his wingman, a kid from Oregon everyone calls Brick, are flying a standard 2-plane section at 12,000 feet. The ceiling is broken clouds. Visibility is good. The radio is mostly quiet except for the occasional check-in. They've been airborne for an hour and 17 minutes. Fuel state is still comfortable. Brick is tucked in tight on Jim's starboard side, exactly where he should be. You can see his oxygen mask and goggles. You can see him scanning head on a swivel like they teach you. Everything is procedure. Everything is correct. Then the Zeros appear. 4 of them. They come out of the sun, which is also procedure, also correct. The Japanese pilots know what they're doing. They've been doing it longer. Jim sees them first, calls it out, and begins the brake turn to deny them a high-side gun pass. This is doctrine. This is what you do. Brick follows. The Hellcats are heavier, faster in the dive and in level flight, but in the turn they give up angles. The Zeros tighten inside them. It happens quickly. Within 10 seconds, Jim can feel it. They're losing the geometry. The enemy has taken the initiative, and now they're going to dictate how this ends. Standard response is to extend away, use the Hellcat speed, separate, and reset. But one of the Zeros has already committed hard to Brick's tail. If Jim extends now, Brick will be alone for the 8 or 9 seconds it takes to create separation. That's enough time for Brick to die. So Jim does something else. He doesn't extend. He tightens his turn, pulls harder. The Hellcat shudders. The airspeed bleeds off. The artificial horizon tilts past 60 degrees of bank. His vision grays at the edges. He's dumping energy, doing exactly what you're not supposed to do in a heavier fighter against a lighter, more maneuverable opponent. He's making himself a better target. He can feel it in his inner ear, in his gut. This is wrong, but he keeps pulling. The turn tightens further. He's almost defenseless now, hanging in the turn, slow and committed. The Zero. That was tracking Brick Switch's targets. It's an instinctive decision for the enemy pilot. The easier kill has presented itself. Jim watches him come. For 2 seconds, maybe 3, Jim is exactly where every tactical manual says you will die. Then, Brick, still with energy because Jim drew the Zero off him, slots into position behind the enemy fighter. It's a shot the Japanese pilot didn't expect to give away. Brick fires. The Zero's wing root ruptures. It snaps into a spin. Jim levels out, shaking, adds power, and extends. His hands are trembling on the stick. The whole engagement lasted maybe 40 seconds. The radio is silent. Neither of them says anything until they're back in the landing pattern. That night in the wardroom, Jim eats mechanically. The food is hot, decent by shipboard standards, but he barely tastes it. He keeps replaying the turn in his mind. The mistake that worked. The wrong decision that created the opening. He knows he got lucky. He knows that if Brick had been a half-second slower, or if the Zero pilot had committed to Jim instead of switching, he'd be in the water now. But he also knows something else. The Zero pilot made the switch because the geometry looked easy. Because Jim made himself look like the mistake. And that meant the enemy pilot stopped thinking about Brick. The idea settles over him slowly, in pieces, over the next week. You can see it in the way he sits in briefings, sketching on his plotting board. Angles, separation distances, turn radii. He's trying to solve a problem that isn't supposed to have a solution. The Hellcat is heavier. The Zero is tighter. These are facts. But facts, he's beginning to understand, are only part of what makes a decision. The rest is what your opponent expects you to do. And if you can make him expect the wrong thing, if you can make your weakness look like an opportunity, then maybe the facts don't matter as much as the deception. According to a post-war analysis compiled by the Naval Historical Center and published in 1994, the tactic that would eventually be formalized as the defensive weave had no single inventor. It emerged from multiple squadrons, multiple pilots, each discovering pieces of the same solution in different engagements. The documentation is fragmentary. No one filed a patent. But the through line is consistent. Someone had to be willing to look like they were losing in order to create the chance to win. By early August, Jim has flown it 4 more times. Each time it works a little differently, but the core is the same. You bait the enemy into committing to the wrong target. You make yourself slow and committed, hanging in a turn that should be suicide. Your wingman, still with energy, becomes the trap. The Zero pilot, trained to exploit exactly the mistake you're pretending to make, takes the bait, and in the 2 or 3 seconds where he's focused on you, expecting an easy kill, he forgets to check his 6. Brick has become very good at not missing that window. They don't talk about it much. It's the kind of thing that's hard to explain without sounding insane. How do you tell someone you've decided to become bait on purpose? How do you brief it to a new wingman without it sounding like a death wish? The heat in the Pacific doesn't let up. The operations tempo doesn't let up. There's a rhythm to carrier life that swallows everything. Wake, brief, fly, debrief, eat, sleep, repeat. Maintenance crews work through the night under red lamps. Ordnance handlers load belts of 50 caliber ammunition into wing bays. Plane captains wipe oil from engine cowlings and check tire pressure and make notations on yellow maintenance sheets clipped to kneeboard holders. The routine is its own kind of armor. You don't think about what could go wrong because you're too busy making sure the checklist gets completed. You don't think about the odds because you're too busy making sure your wingman knows the hand signal for radio failure. One evening in late August, Jim is on the catwalk watching the sunset. The sky is layered in orange and purple and the ocean is almost flat. A chief petty officer, an old-timer who's been in the Navy since before the war, stands a few feet away smoking a cigarette. They don't know each other well. The chief flew as an enlisted observer in biplanes back in the 30s, before the shift to monoplanes and enclosed cockpits. He's seen a lot of young officers come and go. After a long silence, he speaks without looking at Jim. Just loud enough to be heard over the wind. Make sure your wingman knows. Jim doesn't answer right away. Then he nods. The chief flicks his cigarette over the side and walks aft toward the hangar bay. That's the whole conversation. But Jim understands what he means. The tactic only works if both pilots commit to it. If the bait doesn't believe in the plan, he'll flinch, add power too soon, spoil the geometry. If the wingman doesn't trust the bait, he'll extend away instead of staying close enough to exploit the opening. It's built on restraint, on doing less when every instinct screams to do more, on letting the enemy think he's won until the moment he realizes he hasn't. September brings a rotation of new pilots to the squadron. They're fresh from stateside training, sharp in their new flight suits, eager in the way that men are when they haven't yet learned what combat costs. The squadron executive officer assigns Jim to fly with one of them, a kid named Ray from Pennsylvania. Ray is technically proficient. He knows the aircraft systems. He can fly formation. He listens during briefings and takes notes. But he hasn't yet learned that the doctrine they teach you in Pensacola is a starting point, not a finish line. That the real lesson is knowing when to ignore it. Their first flight together is a routine patrol. Nothing happens. The second flight is an escort mission for a photo reconnaissance bird. Still quiet. On the third flight, they run into a pair of Zeros over Bougainville. Jim sets it up exactly the way he has before. He baits the turn, dumps energy, hangs in space, slow and committed. He expects Ray to stay close, to slot into position. But Ray extends. He follows doctrine. He uses his speed advantage to separate like the manual says. The Zeros don't take the bait because there's no trap to spring. They extend too, and the engagement ends in a stalemate. Nobody dies. Nobody gets a kill. They return to the ship. In the debrief, Jim doesn't criticize. He just asks questions. And what did you see? What were you thinking? Ray explains his decision clearly, rationally. He followed training. He preserved his energy state. He avoided entering a turning fight he couldn't win. It's all correct. It's all by the book. Jim listens, then draws on the chalkboard. He draws the angles, the timing, the bait and the trap. He explains it quietly, without drama. Ray listens. You can see him trying to understand it, trying to reconcile what he was taught with what he's being shown. The cognitive dissonance is visible on his face. You're not supposed to want to be slow and committed. You're not supposed to give up your energy advantage. These are the things that keep you alive. But Jim keeps drawing. He shows how the deception works, how the enemy's expectation becomes his vulnerability, how the appearance of weakness creates the opportunity. He doesn't say it's easy. He doesn't say it always works. He just says that sometimes, if you trust your wingman, and if you're willing to look like you're dying for 3 seconds, you can make the enemy forget to check behind him, and that's all you need. Ray flies with Jim 7 more times over the next 3 weeks. On the 4th flight, he does it right. Jim baits. Ray holds. The Zero commits. Ray shoots him down. They don't celebrate. Back on the ship, Ray sits in his bunk for a long time, staring at nothing. You can see it on him, the weight of understanding that he just killed a man by pretending to be weaker than he was, that he used deception to take a life. It's not the same as defending yourself in a fair fight. It's colder, more calculated, the kind of thing that changes how you see yourself. The tactic spreads quietly through the squadron, not through official channels, not through briefings or written doctrine. It spreads the way real knowledge always spreads in military units, through observation, through trust, through the guys who survived teaching the guys who just arrived. By October, most of the Hellcat pilots on Essex are using some version of it. There are variations. Some pilots bait harder, dumping more energy. Some hold the turn longer, trusting their wingman to close the window faster. But the core is the same. Make yourself look like the mistake. Let the enemy think he's winning, and trust the man on your wing to be where he needs to be when it matters. The costs are invisible. There's no line in the after-action reports that captures what it does to you to fly like this, to spend 3 or 4 seconds in every engagement hanging in space, watching a zero line up on you, knowing that if your wingman misses or hesitates, you're dead. To train yourself to suppress the panic that comes from doing everything wrong on purpose. The physical toll is easier to measure. The high G turns, repeated day after day, leave pilots with back pain and neck pain and occasional blackouts from blood pooling in their legs. They develop routines, tensing leg muscles, grunting to keep pressure in the chest, wearing compression G suits when they become available later in the war. But the mental toll is harder to track. You can see it in the way pilots sit in the ready room, quiet, staring at nothing. In the way they take longer to respond when someone speaks to them. In the coffee they drink to stay alert, and the whiskey they don't talk about that helps them sleep. Jim gets promoted to section leader in November. It means he's responsible for training the new guys. It means he has to explain the tactic over and over and watch their faces when they realize what he's asking them to do. Some get it right away. Some take weeks. A few never get it at all, and they rotate to other sections where they can fly more conventional tactics. There's no judgment. Not everyone is wired to fly like this. Some pilots need to feel in control, need to feel like they're winning, and that's fine. But the ones who understand it, who can hold the turn and trust their wingman, they start to survive at higher rates. The kill ratios shift. The after-action reports accumulate in the filing cabinets, and somewhere in the chain of command, someone starts to notice that certain sections are getting better results. By December 1943, the tactic is no longer a secret. It's in the radio chatter. It's in the debriefs. Pilots from other carriers hear about it and start experimenting. The Japanese begin to adapt. They recognize the setup and start baiting their own traps. It becomes a game of double blinds. Who's really bait? Who's really the hunter? The tactical complexity escalates, but the core principle remains. If you can make your opponent commit to a decision based on false information, you own the next 3 seconds. And 3 seconds is enough time to live or die. Jim flies his 100th combat mission on January 9, 1944. It's a strike escort over Rabaul, heavy flak, zeros everywhere. The engagement is chaotic, brief, and close range. He baits twice. Both times it works. Both times his wingman, a new kid named Paul, executes perfectly. They return to the ship. The landing is clean. Jim climbs out of the cockpit and his legs almost buckle. The fatigue is cumulative now. He's been flying combat for 7 months. His hands shake when he signs the yellow sheet. The plane captain notices but doesn't say anything. Everyone's tired. That night, Jim writes a letter home. He doesn't mention the tactic. He doesn't mention the kills. He writes about the food, the weather, the guys in the squadron. He writes about how the sunsets look from the flight deck. He writes that he's fine, that he's safe, that he'll be home soon. All the things you write when you can't write the truth. When he seals the envelope, his hands are steady. The war continues. The squadrons rotate. New carriers join the fleet. The Hellcat proves itself over and over, racking up kill ratios that look impossible on paper. Historians will later attribute it to superior numbers, better training, improved tactics, and the declining quality of Japanese pilots as their experienced aviators are lost and replaced with hastily trained recruits. All of this is true, but buried in the numbers is a smaller truth that someone, at some point, had to be willing to pretend to fail in order to create the chance to succeed. That someone had to teach himself to trust another man's skill more than his own instinct. That the distance between life and death could be measured in the 3 seconds you spent looking weak while your wingman lined up the shot. Jim survives the war. He flies 143 combat missions and is credited with 7 confirmed kills. He receives a Distinguished Flying Cross and an Air Medal with 2 gold stars. The citations mention his courage and skill, but they don't mention the tactic, because there's no elegant way to describe it in official language. How do you write that a pilot distinguished himself by deliberately making himself a target? How do you explain that his contribution was figuring out how to lose convincingly enough to trap the enemy into winning the wrong fight? After the war, Jim returns to his hometown in Illinois. He goes to college on the GI Bill, studies engineering, gets married, has 3 children. He works for an aerospace company for 30 years and retires comfortably. He doesn't talk much about the war. When his kids ask, he tells them small stories, funny stories. The time someone landed gear up and walked away. The time the ship's cat got into the ready room and sat on the duty officer's chair. The surface stories. The ones that don't require explaining what it felt like to hang in a turn, slow and defenseless, watching a Zero's gun sight track onto you, trusting that the man on your wing understood the plan without you having to say a single word. The tactic itself gets formalized eventually. It shows up in training manuals in the 1950s and 60s under different names: defensive scissors, mutual support maneuvers, bracket fighting. The language changes, but the geometry is the same. One pilot baits, one pilot shoots. Trust is the mechanism that holds it together. The willingness to be weak for 3 seconds is the hinge that everything else swings on. In 2008, a naval historian interviews Jim for an oral history project. He's 88 years old. His hands are gnarled, with arthritis, but his mind is clear. The historian asks about the tactic. Jim describes it plainly, without embellishment. He talks about the first time, the accidental discovery, the way it spread through the squadron. He talks about teaching it to the new guys, about watching them learn to trust their wingmen, about the ones who got it right and the ones who didn't. The historian asks if he was scared. Jim pauses, then says yes, every time. But that wasn't the point. The point was making the enemy think you were more scared than you were. The point was the lie you told with your aircraft. The point was that if you could hold the turn for 3 seconds, your wingman had time to do what needed to be done. The historian asks one more question. He asks if Jim thinks it was worth it. The cost, the fear, the hours spent training yourself to suppress every instinct that kept you alive. Jim looks out the window for a long time. Then he says that every pilot who learned it and survived to go home probably thinks it was, and every wingman who stayed alive because his partner held the turn probably thinks it was. And that's the only mathematics that matters. The interview ends. The recording goes into an archive. The transcript gets filed next to thousands of other interviews, part of the enormous effort to document what happened before everyone who was there is gone. Jim dies 3 years later, quietly, in his sleep. His obituary mentions his service but doesn't mention the tactic. Most obituaries don't. The official record is clean and insufficient, as official records always are. But somewhere in the archives, in filing cabinets and digital databases and boxes of yellowing paper, the after-action reports remain. Dry, technical, procedural, altitude, heading, ammunition expended, kill confirmed, aircraft recovered, pilot safe. The language is sparse because the language is required to be sparse. There's no space on the form for describing how it felt to train yourself to want to be in the worst possible position, because that's what made the trap work. No space for recording the trust that built up between pilots who flew together week after week until they could communicate entire tactical decisions with a wing dip or a throttle adjustment. No space for the quiet understanding that survival wasn't about being the best pilot or having the best plane. It was about being willing to look like the worst pilot for exactly as long as it took your wingman to do his job. The geometry is elegant in retrospect. On the chalkboard, with the angles drawn cleanly and the turn radii marked precisely, it looks obvious. Of course you create the bait. Of course you exploit the enemy's expectation. Of course you use deception to create opportunity. But geometry doesn't capture the feeling in your gut when you do it for real, when you dump your energy and hang in space and watch the zero close, when 3 seconds stretches into forever and you're waiting to hear the say, Rattle of 50 caliber guns from behind you, praying they're not yours. The Hellcats' final combat missions are flown in August 1945. By then, the tactic is standard. By then, every pilot knows some version of it. By then, the Japanese pilots who might have adapted to it are mostly gone, shot down or crashed or simply never replaced as Japan's capacity to train new aviators collapses. The war ends. The carriers sail home. The Hellcats are decommissioned, sold for scrap or relegated to training duties or placed in museums. The pilots go home too. They take off their flight suits and put on civilian clothes and try to explain to people who weren't there what it was like. Most of them stop trying after a while. It's easier to just let it go. Easier to let the official history be the story. Easier to not mention that the thing that kept you alive was learning to pretend to die. On the flight deck of a museum ship, decades later, a Hellcat sits under plexiglass, preserved and spotless. The paint is period correct. The markings are authentic. The propeller is polished. Visitors walk past and take pictures. They read the placard that explains the aircraft's specifications: maximum speed, range, armament, kill ratio. The numbers are impressive. The story is heroic. The plane is beautiful in the way that preserved warbirds are beautiful, frozen in a moment that never existed. Clean and perfect and still. But if you could sit in that cockpit, in the dark, with the canopy closed and the smell of old metal and canvas and oil, you might understand something the placard doesn't say. You might understand that the Hellcat's success wasn't just about horsepower or firepower or production numbers. It was about the pilots who learned to fly it in ways that felt wrong until they felt necessary. Who learned that sometimes the most effective attack was looking like you couldn't defend yourself. Who learned that trust was a weapon as important as any gun. Who learned that 3 seconds of controlled vulnerability could buy a lifetime if your wingman was where he needed to be. The tactic isn't in the museum. It's not on display. You can't point to it or photograph it or explain it to a child who wants to know what made these planes special. It lives only in the memory of the men who flew it, and in the archived reports that document its effects without naming its method, and in the negative space of all the pilots who came home because someone else was willing to hang in a turn, slow and committed, trusting that the trap would close before the jaws did. Somewhere in a filing cabinet in Pensacola, there's a form dated June 8, 1943. Standard after-action report, pilot's name, aircraft type, mission description, enemy aircraft engaged, outcome. The handwriting is neat, the language procedural. The report documents a patrol over New Georgia, 2 Hellcats, 4 Zeros, 1 enemy aircraft destroyed, all friendly aircraft recovered. Routine. Unremarkable. Just another data point in a war that generated millions of them. But if you read closely, in the remarks section at the bottom, there's a single sentence in slightly different ink, added later, maybe that night or the next day. It says, defensive turn employed, wingman support effective. 8 words, no elaboration, no explanation, just the acknowledgement that something happened that deviated from standard procedure, that someone tried something new, that it worked, that maybe it was worth remembering. 8 words, and underneath them, the space where the story lives. The space between the doctrine and the decision, between the fear and the trust, between the appearance of weakness and the reality of strength. The space where wars are actually won, 1 3-second interval at a time, by men who learn to lie with their flight path and trust someone else to tell the truth with their guns. The light changes. The museum closes. The Hellcat sits in the dark, waiting for morning, still and silent. And somewhere in the archives, the reports remain, documenting what happened without ever quite explaining why it worked. Documenting the kills without documenting the cost. Documenting the numbers without documenting the feeling of dumping your airspeed and pulling hard and hanging there, defenseless, watching the enemy close while your hand stays steady on the stick and your voice stays calm on the radio and your trust in the man on your wing becomes the only thing between you and the water below. 3 seconds. That's all it ever took. 3 seconds of looking weak while being strong. 3 seconds of pretending to lose while setting the trap. 3 seconds of trust converted into survival. 3 seconds that stretched across 79 years of silence until they became this: a single breath, a single image, a single understanding that victory sometimes looks like vulnerability, and strength sometimes sounds like the absence of your own guns firing, and heroism sometimes feels like nothing more than holding the turn one heartbeat longer while your wingman does what you've trained him to do. The archives preserve the facts. The museum preserves the aircraft. But the truth lives in the 3-second gap between decision and outcome, where one pilot made himself bait and another pilot closed the trap over and over until the geometry of survival rewrote itself and the enemy stopped winning the fight he thought he understood. That's the story. Not the one on the placard, not the one in the history books. The one that lives in the space between what you were taught and what you learned, between the manual and the moment, between the fear and the trust, the one that ends not with a victory or a statistic, but with a habit. Checking your six, trusting your wingman, and knowing that sometimes the best way to win is to let them think you've already lost.